that will become important later on. So the question becomes, why? Why suddenly in the middle of George Bush's war, and a few other little problems we've got with people like Osama and all the other stuff that you see on CNN day and night, night and day and night, why did somebody suddenly whisper in George's ear, hey, what about the moon? You know, we gotta remember the moon. It's important. Okay. So our answer, the Enterprise mission answer, Mike and my combined efforts answer is that the reason that we're now suddenly going back to the moon is because suddenly everybody else can get there. That as long as it was a monopoly between us and the old Soviet Union, we could put the videotape button on pause, and decade after decade didn't have to worry about the moon and what is waiting there, which is pretty amazing. That in fact, it was only now because other nations like Japan and China and India and Russia and the European Union and a bunch of other players that have announced that they have developed the technology that is now sophisticated enough to take them to the moon, to take their unmanned spacecraft and eventually their astronauts, their cosmonauts. I mean, the Chinese are poised for a manned mission to the moon any day, and that's kind of like metaphorical, but again, not really. Tonight, there are two nations, two Asian nations, two Asian superpowers, if you will, that have spacecraft the size of Greyhound buses separately orbiting the moon. There is the Japanese Selene mission, which has a Japanese name that I can't pronounce, so luckily they also gave it the name Selene, which means moon. And then there is the Chinese mission that was launched 2 weeks afterwards. Both are in orbit, both are loaded for bear, as the cliche goes, including ground-penetrating radar to ping, ping, ping stuff far below the visible lunar surface, where, of course, as you're going to see, we strongly suspect and can in part document that there are ruins waiting. So my take is that we're looking at a real new space race, that geopolitically what is happening is that everybody is going to the moon because there is now a race for the ruins, for the prize of technology, for the stunning science and engineering and incredible biological breakthroughs, such as, you know, a technology which could allow human beings to live 1,000 years or 10,000 years, could literally eradicate disease on Earth overnight. Because our great, 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 great ancestors, if our model is correct, which are the guys that did this, built all this stuff, you know, they're perfectly compatible with our genetic code. The stuff that we're going to be looking at, I believe, based on a lot of evidence that we don't have time to get into tonight, is our stuff. Our ancient, ancient, ancient great, 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 great grandmothers, if you will. Now, the part that I didn't do and I skipped over, and I'm not sure whether Mike covered it, is that the real reason why NASA has been hiding all this is under a cover. It's under a fig leaf. It's called this Brookings report, which was in his presentation, which was this formal study that NASA commissioned of the most famous think tank in the world, the Brookings Institution there in Washington, that basically looked at the implications of what would happen if NASA discovered extraterrestrial life sometime in, I love this euphemism, the out years. Did you ever wonder what the out years mean? It means when the current guys that are there are out, and they don't have to worry about what the implications are. Anyway, Brookings said a number of things, one of which was a question: what might be the role of discovering scientists and other decision makers regarding release of the fact of ET discoveries, like ruins? Now, back in the 1950s, in 59, when this study was commissioned, that was a pretty amazing question to ask, because all of us at that time presumed that the role of scientists when they discover something is to publish. Remember the cliche, publish or perish? I am sure that this hit segments of the scientific community, particularly those people working for NASA who had made these discoveries, pretty much between the eyes, because maybe when they signed up they weren't told, oh, and by the way, if you find some of the really cool stuff, you're not going to be able to talk about it. Now, given the fact that the astronauts have become essential stand-ins for scientists, because every astronaut except for Harrison Schmitt, who was a geologist, you know, with degrees out of Caltech, every astronaut has not been a scientist. But he's been the next best thing because he's had all the training and they gave them lessons and rock types and lunar traverses and geological planning and site selection and, you know, rock hammer, how do you break a rock to look at the inside structure? And I mean, they had basically the equivalent of PhD courses in geology, so you could look at them as scientists. Well, in 2004, one of those astronaut scientists, not Schmitt, was sitting in the audience at NASA headquarters that afternoon when the president announced we're going back to the moon. This astronaut was a guy who basically has been championing on every television show I've seen him on, in every lecture format, at every university, in every forum possible, we've got to go back to the moon, we've got to go back to the moon. He was literally the last man to leave the moon. And he was graciously introduced by the president that afternoon. This is actually the moment that I captured from the screen grab. The president graciously demonstrating to him in the audience, and now we'll have a reverse shot and we'll show you what the astronaut did in response. Now, what's wrong with this picture? And what's with the guy next to him, who's obviously watching his reaction and is equally unhappy? Why is this man not smiling? Why isn't he satisfied and gratified that finally another occupant of the Oval Office, the first since John Kennedy, has literally, with the exception of George's father, who, you know, got caught up in all kinds of politics, and it never really was possible that George Bush Sr. was going to get us back to the moon, that this president would be met with this reaction by this man who for all these years has been calling for exactly what took place that January afternoon. If we can answer that question, I think we can answer these questions. Because as with any crime, if I was a DA, if I was bringing an indictment against NASA, we've got the legal means for the crime, which is the Space Act, which basically gives NASA complete license to classify all of the cool stuff and never let anybody know. We have the motive, which is Brookings, which, as Mike told you earlier, issued in its report dire warnings of the collapse of civilization. Now, one of our intel sources gave me a line some years ago that has become kind of like the moniker for Dark Mission. I opened it, you know, kind of with it, and I close with it in the epilogue that I wrote. And it's the lie is different at every level. I believe that Brookings is part of the lie. What Brookings has done is to give those people in NASA an excuse not to tell us what's really been going on and what they found. Does it mean that they really believe that if they told us all this stuff and showed us these amazing images and the other artifacts you're going to see tonight, that civilization would collapse? Well, maybe back in the 50s, but now we've had 30 plus years of Star Trek, Star Wars, Battlestar Galactica, Stargate. I mean, there's just a plethora of ET-oriented film and culture in which we have all been immersed, so immersed that when Robin and I first met, and we kind of were comparing notes as to, well, what do you do and what do you do and all that, and I told her what I did, there was this big yawn like, oh, I've known that. I mean, how do you deal from a relationship that already has reached the apex in under 30 seconds if you've met?